Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. This is an unruly crowd, especially for Carnegie. But it's really nice to see all of you and to welcome all of you to Carnegie. My name is Bill Burns, and I'm the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I often get to stand here at this podium and introduce distinguished leaders, politicians, senior government officials, and experts from around the world. But to be honest, what I enjoy doing most, and what I'm most proud to do, is to introduce extraordinary Carnegie colleagues and their extraordinary work. And Milan Vašnav is certainly one of those extraordinary colleagues, and his new book, When Crime Pays, is truly extraordinary. On its surface, the book might seem like an academic treatise on electoral politics in India, but as you'll learn tonight, it really is a profound piece of scholarship. Milan's research shatters a number of myths and assumptions about why candidates choose to run for office, why citizens vote the way that they do, and why democracies deliver or fail. His findings are informed by rigorous analytics and extensive fieldwork, and they hold important implications not only for the future of India, but for the future of global democracy at a time when it is under siege here at home and around the world. Contrary to the prevailing wisdom that more democracy means more problems, more dysfunction, and more discontent, Milan makes a powerful case that democracy itself is not the issue. It's the failure to invest in the institutions which give it meaning. I can't think of a more timely and important contribution. I can't think of a better example of Carnegie's policy-relevant research, and I can't think of a time when I was prouder to stand at this podium. We're also very grateful that Ishan Tharoor of the Washington Post, and a terrific journalist, has agreed to moderate a conversation with Milan after his opening remarks. So despite my strong inclination to linger up here, to savor this moment and further embarrass Milan, I know Milan's fan club is out in full force this evening to hear from him, not from me. So please join me in congratulating Milan Vašnav and welcoming him to the stage. Thank you all.
Oh, wow. It's great to see all of you here. I have many people to thank, so I hope you'll indulge me for a minute or two. I want to start by thanking Bill Burns for those very kind remarks and for his leadership and for his support of all the work we do here at the South Asia program. I want to thank my South Asia colleagues, many of whom are here today, our communications team, for helping me get the word out. I want to thank Ishan from the Washington Post, who, after I'm done up here, is going to join me and we'll chat a little bit and hopefully chat with you all as well. Of course, I want to thank all of you for coming. Last but not least, I have to thank my parents for being here, who are sitting right up here. They have never, as far as I know, I think, been to a Carnegie event, not just a think tank event. And I think they have this romanticized notion about what actually goes on here, and they're about to find out how boring think tank events actually can be. I'm going to start out telling a story about this gentleman here, a guy by the name of Pappu Yadav. Pappu Yadav is a prominent politician in the North Indian state of Bihar. He started out his career as a small-time gangster, extorting local businesses, engaging in sort of dodgy black market deals, working as a hired gun for local gangs. He blossomed into a full-time, self-styled sort of mafia don, what they call in Hindi a bahubali, so literally a sort of a strong arm, a strong man. He was once described by a journalist as having the physique of a baby elephant and the reputation of a raving, stampeding one. He, at the ripe old age of 23, had accumulated so much political clout that he decided to run for office. And he won handily his first election. A year later, in 1991, he secured a seat in the National Parliament. Now, Pappu Yadav's luck ran out in 2008. He was convicted and given a life sentence for murdering in cold blood a political rival. His political career did not end. he did the natural thing, which is he fielded his wife. His wife stood in his stead and won his seat to Parliament. In 2013, due to some mysterious improprieties with the prosecution's case, he was let go. And he was greeted in this picture here by hundreds of well-wishers outside of his jail cell. Now, Pappu was a pretty special guy. The first thing that he did after getting out of jail was to write a memoir, as one does, called A Solo Traveler During a Time of Rebellion. And far from running away from him, political parties actually rushed to embrace him. So invitations to his glitzy New Delhi book launch for his memoir were secured by leaders from about half a dozen political parties. Within a year, he stood for national office and won again, as did his wife. Today, the only husband and wife couple in Parliament. It was his 5th time as a member of Parliament representing his constituency. Now, Pappu Yadav is a special guy. He's clearly a man of special talents. If you were to enter in, criminal, gangster, India, you'd probably get somebody who looked like him. But there's something deeper going on. This is a map of India broken into its 543 electoral districts, congressional districts. Every constituency you see in orange is represented by a member of Parliament who's under criminal indictment. Okay. Now, I should be clear what that means. These are people who have criminal cases against them. It doesn't mean they've been convicted yet, but it also doesn't mean a mere charge. These are ongoing judicial proceedings against these members of Parliament. As you can see, it literally touches sort of all 4 corners of the country, north, south, east, west. Another way of looking at this data is as follows. So this is from members of Parliament from the last 3 general election cycles, 2004, 2009, 2014, and the share that have criminal cases. Now, there are 2 bars here. The black or grayish bar are those who have cases, and the orange are those who have serious cases. Now, what's a serious case? Take out anything that could be plausibly related to politicking. Libel, slander, electioneering, even take away unlawful assembly, rioting. And what you're left with is murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, extortion, causing grievous harm. That's what that orange number is. So there are 3 things to note about this chart. Number 1 is, as of today, members of Parliament, about a third have cases against them. 1 in 5 have serious cases, which means these are cases that if a conviction were obtained would mean serious jail time. The third thing to note is that these numbers are actually increasing rather than decreasing over time. All right, so what is the book about? So the book is really about the central puzzle, which is how can criminality of such an extent in democracy coexist? Right? How can you have, on the one hand, free and fair elections with robust, competitive, multi-party elections, and such a large number of criminal or corrupt legislators? I mean, democratic theory has taught us that, the great thing about democracy is that if there are elected representatives who betray the public trust, you can boot them out at the next election, right? You can kick the bums out and throw the rascals out. What does it mean for how we think about democratic accountability if the rascals, far from getting kicked out, are actually getting kept in, right? They're elected and often reelected. Many of you probably want to go down to the bar downstairs and start drinking. So I'm going to give you the answer. So if you want to go downstairs, you can. This is the punchline. The argument I make in the book is that politics sort of function like a marketplace, right? Everybody has to survive this kind of market test. And the market has 2 underlying drivers, right? Supply and demand. So there are 2 questions that sort of motivate the book. On the supply side, why is it that parties inject supply of criminals into the marketplace? Why do they embrace them? And then on the demand side, why do voters vote for them? And again, what are widely believed to be free and fair elections? The answer on the supply side comes down to money. In a context when elections have become increasingly costly, parties have not been able to keep up. And so they are looking for individuals who have deep pockets and can pay their own way. And people with serious criminal records represent one important demographic of people who have money to spare. Now, on the demand side, why do voters vote for them? Because in certain contexts, criminality actually signals the credibility to get stuff done, to actually fill a vacuum of representation. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but before I do, as a political scientist, I have to bore you with a little bit of methodology, but I promise it will be painless. The foundation of this book really comes from these documents you see here. In 2003, the Supreme Court of India mandated that anybody who stands for office anywhere in India, at the time of their election, time of their nomination, they have to submit a judicial affidavit in which they detail their financial assets, liabilities, and their criminal records. So what we did, a team of us, was over several years compile these records on about 70,000 political candidates running at the state and national level, beginning in 2003 up until 2014. And that gave us a bunch of interesting patterns to sort of examine. Taking those numbers, we then went into the field and spent time on political campaigns to try to figure out, parties, voters, politicians, how do they interact, right? What is it that's actually making this marketplace tick? This is a picture of me with a well-known mafia don politician named Anand Singh. I'm going to come back to Anand Singh. He's also kind of a colorful guy. Then having lived at this micro level, we kind of zoomed back out and did a bunch of voter surveys to try to see if we could kind of make more systematic generalizations about the stuff we were seeing in the field. And so we asked people about their views on political life, on criminality, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that was painless, right? That was the methodology. Now, getting to the substance. Question number one is, why do parties give these folks, tickets? Why do they embrace them? Now, the shortest answer to this question is because they win. So this is everybody who stood for national office from 2004 to 2014. It's about 21,000 people. This is their chance of winning the election. If they have no case, 6%. And if they have at least one case, 18%. Okay? So candidates who have criminal cases are 3 times as likely to win election to parliament in New Delhi. Now, that's really not that satisfying because we want to know sort of what makes them winnable, right? It comes down to money, as I alluded to before. As elections have gotten increasingly costly, parties have limited capacity to mobilize money. They haven't invested in their kind of organizational rejuvenation. And they've got to find a way to plug this sort of fiscal hole. And so they are searching for candidates who can self-finance. Now, what it means to self-finance is not only pay for the cost of running your election, it also means paying parties for the privilege of running under their symbol. It means subsidizing, say, lesser endowed, poorer candidates who can't afford to run, and maybe occasionally looking the other way if there's some shadiness or some rent-seeking going on. So again, this is that same pool of people who've run for national office the last 3 election cycles, sorted by how wealthy they are. So the far left are the poorest 20% of candidates, the bottom quintile, and the far right is the top quintile, the richest 20%. And this is how likely they are to win the election. 20 times more likely if you're in the richest 20% compared to the poorest 20%, okay? So money really matters. Now, who has money? As I said before, people who are tied to criminal activity. They have the resources and the incentives to deploy that money back into politics. Not necessarily because they have formal immunity in India, which they don't, but obviously you have a lot of perks when you're in power to sort of derail or delay justice. So here's a statistic that kind of illustrates that. The median clean candidate, so a clean candidate here is someone who doesn't have any serious cases against them, is worth about 900,000 rupees. The median criminal candidate is worth 4.1 million. So you have a 4 times as large as financial advantage if you have a serious criminal case against you. Okay, so that's the supply side, right? That's how politicians come into the marketplace via political parties. Now, why do voters vote for them? Which I think is sort of the more interesting part of this question. The argument I make is that criminality has become a badge of honor. that in areas where the rule of law is very weak and government doesn't work very well, politicians use their criminality to signal their credibility to represent their constituents' interests, right? They're protecting those interests. How do they do that? Through four distinct sort of pathways. The first is to intervene in the process of redistribution to make sure that they can direct benefits to their followers, to their constituents. The second is coercion, right? To act as a kind of physical presence to deter threats from rival communities. To act as a sort of giver or provider of last resort, right? Life is uncertain. I might have a death in the family. I've got to pay for a funeral. I have a wife or a daughter whose dowry I have to cover. I need someone who can go to help me out because I don't have those resources on hand. And somebody who can resolve disputes. Everybody knows, India knows that the judicial system isn't exactly the most efficient. And so if you have, say, a property dispute with your neighbor, you just want a judgment so you can go on with your life. And these people are able to provide that judgment. Now, there's a second ingredient. It's not only about government not working. It's also about social divisions. That voters are much more likely to support these characters where social divisions are highly salient. They are not interested in improving life for the community at large, for the constituency at large. They're interested in delivering benefits to their narrow segment of society, segmented by caste, by religion, by ethnicity. And in a place like India, which has a first-past-the-post electoral system, just like the United States, but you have more than two parties, you have in many constituencies 4 or 5 parties, you can win an election with 25 or 30% of the vote, which means if you can carry your group, you don't have to worry about anybody else, right? You don't have to cater to the median voter. So what does this mean? So this is Anand Singh, the guy I showed you before. This is, believe it or not, his re-election poster from 2010. And I saw this and I thought, that's an awfully odd poster. You're used to seeing sort of the candidate and the spouse and the family dog and all of that. Then I remembered that this was the big Bollywood blockbuster of 2010, The Bung. Some of you have probably seen this movie. The Bung is it's an interesting movie, actually. A lot of political salience. The main character is played by Salman Khan. He's a police inspector named Inspector Pandey, who goes by Robin Hood Pandey, who is a crooked cop with a sympathetic streak, okay? He does bad, but he does bad in order to do good. And when I saw these two things, I realized that this is not coincidental, right? This is very much on purpose. That voters are voting for Anand Singh, not in spite of his criminality, but because of his criminality. And when I went and asked one of Anand Singh's voters, this guy has a pretty lengthy rap sheet, he has a murder charge, he has a rape charge, a lot of bad stuff. And he said, no, you don't understand. Anand Singh is not a murderer, he merely manages murder. It's like, okay, which is, maybe a little bit better on the hierarchy. But what he was trying to say is that he is the CEO of a kind of local protection racket. Right? I'm getting something out of this guy. He's not just someone who sort of rapes and pillages. Okay, so what can we do if we want to address this problem? So there's a short term and a long term. The short term is obviously you could help to clean up the supply, which means cleaning up political funding. Right now, there's no transparency around political contributions. Political parties aren't subject to any kind of independent audit. There are very weak enforcement powers for election agents to try to take action against people who flout these rules. That would certainly help. But it's not going to do anything to get at the underlying demand for this issue. And in the long run, right, the only solution is to improve governance from the ground up. And you need to do two things simultaneously. I think a lot of people who have interacted with the Indian state, I'm guessing many people in this room would love to just sort of slash and burn and see it shrink considerably. But that's not the right answer. You need to shrink the red tape and cut back the procedures, all of this paperwork that's in this poor bureaucrat's office, But you actually need to create more bureaucrats. You need to create more doctors and more judges and more police officers and people who can actually fulfill the sovereign responsibilities of the state. So somewhat paradoxically, it's over-bureaucratized in procedural terms, but undermanned in personnel terms. So what does this mean for other democracies? And then I'll stop and invite Ishan to come join me up here. The first is, and I think this should maybe resonate with some of us in this room, is don't underestimate the voters. They're not stupid, right? This isn't about voters being pawns in some game that's being rigged by people. They know what they're getting, and they have a strategic calculation for voting the way that they do. The second is think about the role that money is playing, right? We often say, there's all of this money, it's affecting policy outcomes we might care about, and all of that is true, but it's also having a subtler but just as important effect, which is shaping who comes and joins politics in the first place, right? It's narrowing the talent pool of people who are willing to come forward. Lesson number 3 is that sunlight is not always the best disinfectant. Now, transparency is good for a lot of things. As I always tell people, I couldn't have done this study without transparency because no one would have ever had to sort of declare these affidavits. But that's not the binding constraint on voter behavior, right? Telling voters that so-and-so is a bad person who has lots of criminal cases is probably not telling them something they don't already know. Last but not least, in a very perverse kind of way, this is democracy in action. Right? These politicians are running in some of the world's most competitive elections and winning. And we need to think about that and how criminality of this type can actually be compatible with democratic accountability. Maybe not in the ways we'd like to see, maybe with all kinds of unintended consequences, but they're actually existing within this kind of democratic marketplace. All right. Thanks very much. I want to invite Ishan Tharoor, and while he's getting settled up here, Ishan writes for the Washington Post. He is the author of a new daily column, which you all should subscribe to, called Today's Worldview. Prior to joining the Post, he was an editor and reporter at Time Magazine. And some of you may have seen that in the last 12 months or so, the Washington Post has surpassed the New York Times in terms of page views. I will that's either a correlation or causation, but it happened just around the time that Ishan joined. So,
well, thank you so much. It's great to be here for Milan's book launch. It's a wonderful turnout. This is my first time looking in this direction at a Carnegie event, and I'm really delighted to be here. I'm Ishan Tharoor. I'm writer of the Washington Post. And as Milan said, I'm now just launched this project where I'm every day reckoning with Trump in the world. So it's really great to be here talking about a much more uplifting subject. So I think just to get us started then, I was wondering, India is not the only country that has a politics where corruption and crime is endemic or entrenched in various ways. There are other countries in Asia, I'm thinking Pakistan, thinking, say, the Philippines, where on a certain level it's even more shameless. And so to what extent, is there a way in which the scale of crime and criminality in India and its nexus in India's political life is different than other places? What are the kind of global comparisons that you were thinking about when you approach the subject?
Yeah, I think the first reaction that many people had when I started working on this is said, it sounds to me like you're describing, turn of 20th century American politics, right? This is sort of Tammany Hall and so on and so forth. I think there's certainly a lot of truth to that, right? This commingling of crime and corruption and politics is certainly not new. It's not unique to India. I think there are a couple of things, however, which make India unique. One is obviously the scale, right? The numbers are pretty stark. The second is the nature of the crime we're talking about, right? This is not sort of embezzlement or white-collar crime. I mean, for lack of a better word, this is sort of blue-collar crime. And in many countries, including in our own, you see criminals, corrupt people operating at the periphery of politics. And they're often kingmakers, right? They're sort of making a bet and they're backing somebody who's the front man or the front woman. In India, what's so interesting is that the criminal and the politician are the same person. And that wasn't always the case. So if you go back and you rewind the clock to the 1950s, when you just had one major dominant party, which was the Congress Party, criminals were hired guns. They worked for political parties, and they could rest easy at night knowing that the Congress was going to win the election the next day. Once that started to break down, they had to make a choice. Because if they backed the Congress and the Congress lost, then they were going to be in trouble. And so what you see over time as they had accumulated their own clout is a sort of vertical integration, right? Think about an automotive company that decides to manufacture tires, right? They sort of do everything in-house. That's what they decided to do. And I think in many countries, you still see some of this separation, where you have godfathers who are sort of operating, backing candidates, but they're not necessarily the same person who's on the ballot who people are sort of voting for.
I mean, just to take a small, I mean, actually a rather big step back, why isn't there a larger sense of crisis in India about just the numbers that you're talking about, a third of the parliamentarians having these kinds of cases? Why isn't there a kind of greater national sense of alarm?
It's sort of the same reason why there's not a national sense of alarm in India about malnutrition. Everyone should be, shouting from the rooftops about how people are dying. Why is that the case? Because it's blended into the mundane and the everyday. It sort of becomes something that's totally routinized. And when I would talk to Indians when I started writing this book, they sort of said, "Well, why do you want to write this book? I mean, you're just describing everyday life. That's not very interesting." And I said, no, but it is interesting to some of us, because it's sort of there and therefore accepted as a given. And so no one has ever sort of tried to understand, what is it that makes this tick? And only when you understand that can you understand how do you unwind that system. I think, and that's the case. And, it's not restricted to any one state, any one political party, any one ideology. I mean, this is sort of a equal opportunity issue.
So you talked a little bit about your methodology in your presentation. For those who pick up the book, you'll see that it's an incredible piece of research, reportage almost. I can say that as a journalist. And it's really remarkable the many layers of documentation, statistical analysis, and then just almost anthropological analysis that you put into it. Could you tell the audience a little bit about sort of the genesis of the book and the amount of time, the many years that it spans in terms of work that you put into it, and the places that you went?
Yeah. So it started when I was a PhD student who had no clue what I was doing, and I decided to spend a summer in India and working on some really esoteric subject that I've sort of half forgotten. And I remember sitting one day and watching the scene unfold on television where, so many of you who work on U.S.-India relations will remember in 2008, there was a crisis in India because the government faced a vote of no confidence over the U.S.-India civil nuclear deal. This was the Congress government at the time of Manmohan Singh. And they were so worried that they were going to lose this vote of no confidence and there would be fresh elections and all the rest, that they temporarily furloughed 6 MPs who had been convicted on murder charges to come to the floor of Parliament to vote just to make sure that the government had enough votes. And so I remember watching the television and sort of seeing these 6 guys, including Papu Yadav, who I talked about at the beginning. So they're criminals in Indian politics. This is interesting. And, nobody sort of made much fuss. I mean, there was sort of a little blurb and there was something in the paper the next day, but no one really said much about it. And I thought, well, is this a thing? I mean, is this sort of a widespread thing? And sort of the more I dug in, almost the murkier it became. And I figured out that, there really was this strange market at work that needed to be unpacked. So it was completely unintentional. And it was really that one moment that sort of set the light bulb off. And then it sort of took off. And I remember feeling at some point, this started in 2008, that I gotta finish this thing. This thing has been going on for too long. But the numbers kept going up. So I thought, well, this book is going to have a long shelf life, so I could take as long as I want, because it's not going to go anywhere.
And so talk a bit about some of the places that you went and the politicians stroke criminals that you followed around.
Yeah, obviously I started in Delhi, and I talked to a lot of politicians and party workers and retired bureaucrats to sort of get a sense of what was happening. And then the first campaign I kind of observed was in 2010 in Bihar, which many of you know, Bihar is sort of the hotbed of crime and corruption, and it's also a very poor state. And I spent some time on the campaign trail, just following these people around, trying to understand, sort of what's going on. And then I did that 2 other times. I did that in Gujarat, which is in the west, which is the state Narendra Modi is from, state that my family happens to be from. And then in Andhra Pradesh, which is in the south. And in Andhra, I didn't follow a criminal politician, but I followed a first-time candidate who was a very successful entrepreneur, Western educated, came from means, decided to run for office. And I saw sort of firsthand how much he was spending and how you sort of get onto this hamster wheel you can't get off. So this particular individual, whose name I sort of obscure in the book, I call him Sanjay, spent about $2 million of his own money, which, if you do the calculation, that's a lot of money in rupees. And he said this thing which I'll never forget, which is, before I left the constituency, I said, good luck, hope you win. And he said, yeah, if I win, you gotta come back, and I'll show you around the state legislature. I said, great. And he said, but if I win, I probably have to do some pretty bad stuff, because I got to raise money to win 5 years from now. So he was sort of, wanted to give me the caveat up front that, he was going to be a sort of different person when I came back the next time.
Were there any kind of, this is the journalist question, were there any kind of dicey moments in terms of your interactions with these people? I mean, you're asking them about particularly nefarious activities here and there.
Yeah, it's a question I get a lot. The flippant answer is no, because they're parading this around in front of everybody. So it's hardly a secret to sort of share it with somebody like me. But I think to be honest, I benefited a little bit from a kind of insider-outsider thing. I happen to be of Indian extraction, but born and raised in the United States, and so most of these guys thought it was pretty cute, that, this guy who doesn't know anything, who's doing a PhD, has come down and, come sit, let me explain to you, how politics works in this area. And so it was a sort of bizarre kind of a feeling, but in a way it sort of worked. It worked to my advantage. And, I think the thing that I realized very quickly is that you have to be careful about asking about the money. People would be happy to talk about, like, I'm wanted for 3 murders in 3 districts. That wasn't an issue. But when you started talking about their pocketbooks, it became a bit, they got sort of, they clammed up. And then you had to do more triangulation. Of course, you had these affidavits, which, aren't perfect. They're self-reported. There's definitely some measurement error. But they give a kind of ballpark sense of kind of what's going on.
So about the money, last year, on the day of the election here, India embarked on this incredibly radical scheme of demonetization. I'll let Milind explain that when he answers this question. And many people assume that this scheme was related to elections and related to the prevalence of undisclosed black money in elections. How has your thinking about sort of the nexus of crime and politics evolved just in the space of the past few months ahead of these elections in UP?
Yeah. So November 8th, while we were getting ready for a momentous day over here, Prime Minister Modi announced this radical demonetization plan in which he sort of overnight invalidated about 86% of India's currency. So basically eliminated the 500 and 1,000 rupee notes, which are sort of the upper denomination notes, on the theory that if you're engaged in corrupt or illicit activities, it's a lot easier to do that in bigger notes because, frankly, you don't have to worry about carrying briefcases that are, quite as big. And he announced this in the evening, and 4 hours later, at the stroke of midnight, that money was useless. I mean, you could still deposit it into your bank account, within a certain time period. But of course, that money became in banks and had to come above board. Now, this was a hugely traumatic event in some ways, and people like Sadan and others have written about this more than I have. But the end result of it was, the hope was you're going to invalidate all this money, and people would get screwed. They hold all this black currency, but all the currency made it back into the system. So some way or another, people found a way, maybe taking a haircut, but laundering this money back into the system. And so the big payoff never really materialized. Now the Modi government is feeling the heat because they've made people go through massive inconvenience, but they don't have any big fish they've really caught. No politicians who have been sort of jailed because of this. But because of that, in the budget that was released yesterday, they have introduced 4 measures to reform election funding. So in a perverse kind of a way, although the actual act didn't do very much, it's forced them to try to do something.
So what are some of the practical, medium-term, maybe long-term political processes that could, change the landscape in such a way that there isn't such a shadow of crime on Indian politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think what they've tried to do is clean up the money, but it's been I'll try to be as charitable as possible. They've taken steps that are great in terms of claiming the moral high ground, but they're not so great in terms of what kind of impact they're going to have on the ground. I mean, I think that's the fairest way to put it. Now, they get credit for raising the issue at all, but what would you do if you were really serious about this? So the first thing you would do is you're basically telling all of India that you need to move to a 21st century cashless economy. Well, the first people you should start with are political parties, right? But political parties can still take donations in cash. There's something called the Right to Information Act, which is like our FOIA, our Freedom of Information Act. There was a ruling which said that political parties are subject to the Right to Information Act. Political parties responded by saying, we don't recognize your jurisdiction to tell us that, and so we're just not going to comply. And so the Information Authority said, we actually can't do anything about this. Sorry. There is auditing of party books done by an in-house hand-selected auditor. So you can imagine that, people come in, they give them the paperwork, they sign it, and they're never to be heard from again. But again, as I mentioned, those are sort of things that'll help get at this one element of the problem. I think the bigger question is, how do you deal with the infirmities of the state, right? I mean, you look at the justice system, you've got 31.5 million pending cases winding their way through the Indian court system. You've got 25% of the police force, the civil police force, which doesn't exist. The posts are sanctioned on paper, they don't exist in practice. You've got the fewest number of bureaucrats per capita of any G20 economy. Now, obviously, it's more complicated than having more people. You have to have good people and qualified people and all the rest of it. But that's a generational issue, right? I mean, that's not something that's going to change overnight because it requires resources, it requires planning, it requires human capital, higher education, all of these things where India has fallen behind.
On that kind of very heavy note, I'd love to get some audience questions in. Just raise your hand, identify yourself, and listen. Identify yourself as there.
Have any geographic
Yeah. I mean, I think, we certainly have this benchmark of states that are better governed and states that are worse governed. But, states are these huge geographic entities, right? I mean, a state like Uttar Pradesh, which is about to go for election, has 200 million people, right? So if it were a country, it'd be like the 5th biggest country in the world, the 6th biggest country in the world. There's a lot of heterogeneity or variation that's going on within states, right? So even a place like Gujarat, right, which is a well-to-do, prosperous state, it was the state that Modi ran for a dozen years. You go out to Western Gujarat, and you think you're in the Wild West. I mean, these are places where the local state is not very present. So that's part of the answer. The second part of your answer is, India is a very diverse country with a lot of social cleavages, but they're not activated all in the same way. And a lot of that has historical reasons for why divides between castes are greater or smaller. But in those places where there's a lot of churning over sort of social dominance, which community controls the levers of power, is sort of where you see these things. So, it surprised me to see Kerala. If you go to northern Kerala, I mean, people find a lot of political violence. If you go to a place like West Bengal, where the conflict isn't so much necessarily on ethnic lines per se, but it's on very clear partisan or ideological lines and almost mask ethnicity. So I think ethnicity is happening, probably everywhere or most places, but then you also see these nuances and particular patterns in some corners of India.
There in the front, and then we'll go get towards the back.
I'm Howard Schaefer. How strong is sentiment in India about this issue? People really care, or are they just shrugging it off? That's the way things are going.
Yeah. So we did a survey where we asked voters around the country, this was around the time of the 2014 election, about 50,000 voters, so this is a big survey. How do you feel about voting for a member of parliament who happens to have serious cases but gets stuff done? And 26% of voters say they'd be fine with that. And I suspect if you ask that question in a slightly more sophisticated way, where people could really tell you what they believe, the number would probably be even higher than 26%. So I think people are aware of this. It's not like, it's anybody's first best option or vision of how politics should be, but it's sort of the one that they've got, right? And so you see things like what's happening right now, to come back to Uttar Pradesh, where you have a state which has a lot of criminals in politics. You have a leading candidate to be chief minister of that state who has a pretty clean reputation of being a reformer, of taking on so-called bad elements. Now, people are voting for him, but they're also voting for their local candidate, and they're hedging their bets. They would like Mr. Clean to come over and make everything work, but that's probably not going to happen overnight. And so in the short term, in their proximity, they're going to need someone who's going to have their back. So hopefully over time, Mr. Clean Chief Minister can spread his wings and deepen the reach of the state, and I won't need my local insurance anymore. But until those two things meet, I think you're going to keep having this, disjuncture.
That first hand in the back, you sir, the blue shirt.
Is there an urban-rural divide? I mean, typically, I'm from Bombay, and I hardly know if anyone goes out and votes, honestly. And I think
that says something.
And I think we do know statistically that the rural turnout in India is more than the urban turnout. But I'm wondering whether there's a rural divide even in the sort of, politicians who stand up.
Yeah. Yeah, let's do that. Sure.
Let's just do a few more questions, and then we'll put it all together. Ma'am in the pink jacket right there. Oh, I'm making this very hard for you. Sorry.
So toward
please
the end,
identify yourself before.
Parveen Huda. At the end of your talk, you mentioned that this kind of phenomenon could be compatible with accountability, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the kinds of campaigns that these people under indictment would run. So, for example, were there higher incidences of voter fraud, intimidation? You know, how clean or dirty of a campaign do they run, particularly as compared to the so-called clean ones who were not under indictment?
Quick question. Does crime pay for women?
Okay, so you got that? The urban-rural divide?
Yeah.
Crime pays women? And then that middle question.
Yes, sure, about accountability. So on the urban-rural one, it's happening in both places. And I think this is partially a function of how urbanization has been managed or mismanaged in a lot of India, where sort of people came to the city expecting sort of a higher quality of public service delivery, and what they're finding is that urban and local governments aren't able to deliver that. And so a party, you said you're from Bombay, like the Shiv Sena, is able to create an almost parallel administration, right, of dispensing all of those things I mentioned, security, justice, so on and so forth, like in the deepest parts of the inner city of Bombay. So I think that's something, when I think out into the horizon about what worries me the most, I mean, one is clearly the demographic shift we see in India of all of these young people entering the labor force, not finding jobs. And the second is this rural to urban transformation, because, the numbers are pretty staggering. The second, on the accountability point, I'm pretty careful in the book, I think, to sort of point out that obviously this accountability is somewhat partial. As I mentioned before, if they create lasting, sustainable solutions for everybody in their districts, they're going to write themselves into irrelevance, right? Then no one needs them anymore because the state's working pretty well. So they want things to work, but they want to be seen as the person who mediates between the citizen and the state. And again, they want to do it for some segment of society where that allows them to kind of burnish their bona fides. I think that the kind of argument that I was sort of militating against is that I think there's an impression of these folks being kind of little subnational dictators and authoritarian figures. And I think that it's more useful to think of these folks as a sort of product of democracy rather than its antithesis, if that makes any sense. On the crime pays and women, there are very few women criminals in politics, which is an argument for having more women run and win elected office. There are a few, and the way Indian politics is played out, many of them who are criminals or associate with criminality often are the wives or family members of people who can't contest elections, and so they need to field somebody in their family who can. But yeah, I mean, there is a very bad gender imbalance that makes men look pretty bad.
Let's do another round of questions. I know there are drinks to be had and books to be signed, so don't want to keep you here too long. You, ma'am, in the far back. Are there other mics there? Sorry.
I just want to make sure that I'm not missing the point that you were actually saying. But is it the case that the crime pays because the voters vote for the criminal not just because they have more money to win the election, but they then mobilize a kind of criminal network to provide services that the state is not providing? Is that part of the argument?
Okay, we got that. Just that hand on the left right there, just right next to you.
I'd like to bring it home. Is there any way you can reform the criminals? Is there any way? I think we have some with mental health problems that might have some commitment to mental health. Any thought of that for our country? Really important. We're stuck for 4 years if we're not careful.
You're going to get me in trouble.
And you, ma'am, in the pink jacket.
Oh, that's my colleague, Sarah. You don't have to call on her. That's,
Sarah Chase, Carnegie
he's
Endowment.
going to ask a
Also,
tough
to bring it
question.
home, your slide, one of your final slides about those sort of proximate
Yeah.
causes, right? Campaign financing, you mentioned that it offers opportunities for basically moving dirty money into the system. So making a comparison to the United States, which I know is unfair, but on proximate causes, given what you know about how U.S. political financing is structured, are you able to make a comparison between features of the Indian system in this regard and features of the American system in order to instruct us as to whether not just money might be unaccountably put into American political campaigns, but whether campaign financing might be a vehicle for getting dark money into the personal pockets of U.S. Political candidates.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have the sort of chicken and egg question of, why are they voting for these criminals? Is it because they feel coerced or because the criminals create the infrastructure for better life? Question about whether these criminals can reform when they enter politics, and then the comparative gestures to the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, the second and third are oddly related, but let me start with the first. Yeah, I mean, I think the argument is that, again, where you have these two things coming together, government isn't working as it should, and people don't believe it to be an impartial provider of basic things the state should do, and where you have these social cleavages made salient. Right, these folks come in and enter as Robin Hoods, and they're seen as saviors, and they're people who know how to get stuff done for their groups, and so that's where the crime pays. Now, the money certainly helps. It helps them provide those things. It helps them gain access to the political system in the first place. But there are many cases of such figures getting thrown out for non-performance. Right? They become too in it for themselves. They no longer care about the people. They become disconnected, and they do get booted. So there is a replenishment, right? I mean, they tend to win, they tend to reproduce, but they're not untouchable from a electoral standpoint. I think that's important to point out. Number two is, can they reform themselves? And Sarah's question, I think in some ways this is a bit of a downer, but the hope is that you sort of move into an American-style equilibrium from where you are now, which is to say, these folks like Papu Yadav and Anand Singh and all, what are they doing now? They've become legitimate business people. So, it's a transition from Godfather 1 to Godfather 3, right? You start as the sort of the mafia don, and then by the end, you're doing everything in white, right? I mean, you've got a marketing complex, you've got a mall, you've got full businesses. Now, that's a different kind of corruption potentially they open yourself up to, but it takes some of this sort of violence, I think, out of the picture. And I think you're seeing this transformation. Now, to get to Sarah's point, I mean, that's not necessarily the most hopeful scenario. In the past decade, as I've been it really has been a decade almost since I started working on this, there have been a lot of changes in the United States. When I first started on this project, people said, if only we could be more like you guys. Because there is some stuff going on in the United States, some shadiness, but by and large, there's pretty good reporting. People can put pieces together if there were a quid pro quo. Now we move to a system where money truly has become dark. That paper trail has gone cold, right? You have things like Citizens United, like super PACs, where you can't necessarily follow A to B to C to D. And so that, I think, is a real regression in my own view in the United States. There's a saying, and some of you have heard me use this before, that, and I've never been able to find out who said this, that the difference between the United States and India is that in India, corruption's in the law breaking, and in the U.S., it's in the law making. right? So I think that may be the path that India is headed towards. Sorry to leave you on a kind of a less than optimistic note.
They're in the purple tie.
Tunir Mukherjee, CSIS. Thank you so much for the presentation and, of course, the book. So in 2013, there was this case, Lily Thomas versus Union of India, which passed judgment that anybody who receives 2 years of imprisonment can't qualify as an MP or MLA in the assembly. So do you think that leads a path where the judicial system can actually inflict upon the crime side of Indian politics, or is it just something that's in the book but never can be implemented?
No, man, I think this is it's a great question. So for those of you who aren't familiar, in 2013, the Supreme Court of India ruled that if you're a member of parliament or a member of the state legislature and you've been convicted of a certain class of serious crimes and a judge hasn't put a stay on your conviction, you're disqualified immediately. You've got to give up your seat. And that was seen as a pretty big deal and a way to sort of help cleanse politics. Now, the problem is almost nobody gets convicted, right? Lots of people with cases, but very few who actually see their cases through their logical conclusion, right? And these things are going on for 10, 15, sometimes 20 years, and a lot happens. Judges die, evidence goes missing, witnesses get cold feet, right? I mean, these are all sort of the practicalities of real life. And so, therefore, there has been a call for a reform that says, look, if you are an elected politician and you have a serious case against you, that if you were convicted, you would be put away for 2 years or 5 years, and that case wasn't sort of put on you right before the election, right, to protect against political motivation, shouldn't be able to stand for election at all until that's cleared up. Now, that introduces another huge problem because, there is the presumption of innocence before being proven guilty, right? And India is a country where they have the rule of law. So there is a modification to that, which in fact, sometimes the Prime Minister has even talked about, which says, okay, you're not immediately disqualified, but we're going to take your case and put it on some kind of fast track course, so that, within a 12-month period, 18-month period, those cases get adjudicated. But, the moment you put someone's case on a fast track, you're implicitly putting someone else's case on a slow track, right? And so it's a hard bargain, obviously, to sort of strike, and that's where we are. We're at this impasse where unless you get convicted, there's very little legally that can be done.
A few more questions, and then we'll wrap up.
I'm Sadanand Dhume from the American Enterprise Institute. So I'd like to relate this to something else you've worked on, which is this idea of a balance between national parties and non-national parties. Now, you could imagine, at least in theory, that the rise of a large national party like the BJP, which is not going to lack for resources, is going to at least affect the supply side of your equation. Is there any evidence that national parties that are well-resourced are less likely to rely on these figures, or is that not true?
It's a great question, Sadanand. Do you want to take another one, or should we stop it?
Let's take one more after.
Yeah.
Let's take one
You
more.
want to take one?
You, ma'am, in the back. You've been.
I'm Ellen Allison from SAIS. My question is about the relationship between crime and corruption. So your research seems to suggest that voters are willing to vote for someone with a criminal background because they can deliver. But the 2014 national election and the electoral survey data suggests that voters were very upset with the corruption of UPA2. So what are your thoughts about, does crime pay but corruption doesn't? And then my second question is, more broadly, you've been looking at the electoral system for over a decade. How would you describe the electoral system? In political science, it's been characterized as a patronage democracy, but it doesn't look like it's just that. So is it a system in transition?
Okay, great questions. Sadanand's question on national parties versus state parties. I mean, what the data reveal is that there's really no difference in terms of the prevalence. Now, you have to remember that when a party like the BJP truly becomes a national force, right? That's the ruling party today, the party of Narendra Modi. They're now contesting elections in more places than ever before. So yes, they're raising more money, but they're also spending more money, right? And so that whatever they're raising is getting spread more thinly across the entire country, as opposed to being concentrated in some pockets. When it comes to corruption versus crime, I think this is a really good question, and it's something that I get to in the last chapter as saying, I mean, this is maybe a subject for another book, because it is it's an important question that I wasn't able to fully answer. I mean, my analysis and my sense of it is that politicians who are purely known in India for being corrupt don't pass muster on average with voters. Now, most of the people who are criminals tend to also be corrupt, but they have something else that's going for them, right? It's not, so the difference is they are not simply taking money from the state and putting in their own pocket for their personal enrichment. Now, they may be doing that, but they're also doing something else in addition, right? And I think that's a sort of difference, where people are okay with you getting rich as long as you're proving yourself to be valuable to me in some way as a constituent. Then when it comes to the last question about transition, I mean, I don't have a great answer to this other than to say that, the story of India in some ways, if you think about the past, well, first of all, I mean, India is an amazing experiment, right? I mean, never before have you had a democracy at such a low level of per capita income open up the floodgates to free and fair elections, right? And have it survive intact for 70 years. So that's one. Number two is the past 25 years have seen massive progress. You've moved from a one-party system to a multi-party democracy. You've moved from a closed economy to a more open economy. You've moved from a foreign policy in cahoots with the Soviet Union to one where we talk about the US and India being the defining partners of the 21st century. We've moved from a social system where, yes, caste divisions loom large, but increasingly as a marker of difference rather than of hierarchy. But the thing that hasn't changed is the institutions, right? I mean, the fundamental nuts and bolts of the state haven't changed. And in some ways, the success of all those other things have put pressure on this element. And that gap that's opened up is the cause of this problem. So that's maybe the optimism I'll leave you with, is that, this is not an entirely a doom and gloom story, right? I mean, there is a lot of progress that's been made, a long way to go, and we can debate the extent and the pace and all the rest of it. But the challenge for India in the 21st century, right, is really getting this institutional piece right. And that's something which takes a truly visionary leader, because that's not a task that's going to be completed in 5 years. I mean, that's, again, as I mentioned, that's really a generational challenge.
Well then, I would say thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Congratulations again to Milind.
Thank all of you.
And there are books to be signed. It's a tremendous feat of research and analysis, and there are drinks to be had.
Yes, downstairs. I hope everyone can join us for the reception.
Thank you all again.
Thanks.